I would like to welcome everybody to our IEO webinar series. My name is Nicoletta Batini, and I'm the lead evaluator of the IEO and also the webinar series coordinator. And today we will be looking at food prices and food security. The title of our webinar is Sustainability Implications of the War in Ukraine for Global Food Prices and Global Food Security. So we all know that a really great share of the world's basic grains come from Ukraine and Russia, which have very, very rich soils. And the current war in Ukraine has, of course, disrupted production and exports from both countries. And these, in turn, has directly impacted global food prices and food supply with potentially disastrous implications for global food security. Indirectly, restrictions on trade related to sanctions to Russia for this war have also increased costs worldwide for energy and transport. And they have restricted the export of fertilizers, a large share of which, as will be discussed today, are produced in these countries. And these further elevated prices of grains and disrupted grains market. It looks like with a disproportionate amount of people around the globe consuming wheat-based products, that the food security impacts of what's going on today will be felt inequitably across the globe. So we invited two experts of World Agricultural Commodity Trade and Production, Joseph Glauber and David Laborde, both at IFPRI, and they will discuss and present the status of global food security, the challenges arising from the Ukraine war, and they will explore approaches for improving preparedness from a global agricultural point of view for crisis response, and also the strategies that might be applicable at different scales and opportunities for international collaboration. Before I pass the mic to them, I just want to introduce them very briefly. I think they need no introduction. I've been presenting their knowledge about these matters in the past months very intensely. They're very sought after speakers. Joe Glauber is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., where he studies price volatility, global grain reserves, crop insurance, and trade. Before joining IFPRI, Joe spent over 30 years at the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, and he was chief economist from 2008-2014 at the USDA, responsible for the department's agricultural forecasts and projections, overseeing climate, energy, and regulatory issues. And he also served as chairman of the board of directors of the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. Between 2007 and 2009, Joe served as the special Doha agricultural envoy at the Office of the United States Trade Representative, where he served as chief agricultural negotiator in the Doha talks. And David Laborde is a senior research fellow in the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Division and team leader on macroeconomics and trade for IFPRI. His research interests include globalization, international trade, measurement, and modeling of protectionism, multilateral and regional trade liberalization, as well as environmental issues, including, of course, climate change and biofuels. And recently, he has been focusing on costing the roadmap to achieving SDG 2 in a globalized context, while considering the role of goods, capital, and migration flows. And beyond his work on databases in the field of international trade and foreign policy monitoring, he has developed several partial and general equilibrium models applied to trade policy and environmental issues. So I met Joe and David before in a report that was written over almost a year and a half for UNEP, UNDP, FAO on repurposing agricultural subsidies. So I know they're the best people around to tell us what's going on now on the supply and food security. I'm just going to pass the mic to you, and you're going to, I think, decide between yourselves who's going to take the lead in talking. Thank you so much for being with us, Joe and David.
Thanks, Nicoletta. I'll start, and then David will tag team with me, and then we'll come back at the end, both talking about policy recommendations and other sorts of things. But thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. As you say, it's been quite busy. I think David and I actually started right after the first of the years, looking at, just because, as we'll see, markets were already tightening. And then when the tensions started rising in the Black Sea, we started working on that and to see what the implications would be. And even before we could get, well, we're ready to go out with a blog, actually Russian troops entered Ukraine, so we ended up rewriting quickly, but had something out that first day, and it's been pretty much nonstop since then. But let me begin. David, if you could advance the slide. So how we're going to split this, I'm going to talk a lot about the grain and vegetable oil markets, and then turn it over to David, who's going to treat the next two issues on fertilizer and energy markets. As Nicoletta said, this is Black Sea, or at least Russia in particular, and also Belarus are very large suppliers of important nutrients to the world markets. And then David's going to also talk about particular vulnerabilities to countries from a variety of different aspects. And I think one of the key takeaways here is it's not homogeneous in the sense of everyone is being hit by high wheat, or everyone is being hit by high wheat prices, but the problems that are being felt by individual countries differ substantially depending on their economics, et cetera. And then we'll both talk about policy responses. Next slide. Next slide. So first of all, again, rising prices before the invasion. We saw that already the food price index, which is a commodity price index, not a retail food index, but we had seen those rise starting about mid-2021 for a lot of commodities. It started improving, some of this due to the recovery with COVID, others due to other factors. But also an increase in food insecurity. This has been well documented over the last 2 or 3 years that we've seen. Again, I think at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of thought that we could have maybe see some moderation in prices moving forward, but then this invasion happened. Next slide, please. So the drivers of rising prices before the invasion, of course, is we have had just incredible strong demand, and a lot of that due to China, a lot of it China recovering from African swine fever. And their hog population and poultry number of poultry production increasing, which meant a huge increase in demand for feedstuffs, including maize and other grains, but also oil seeds. And then just like in any year, we do have weather disturbances around the world that affect yields. In this case, we had a drought in North America that affected the northern plains of the U.S. in terms of wheat production, and also Canada, rapeseed production, that is canola, and wheat production there. We've had a La Nina event. We're now in the third year of a La Nina event that has hurt South American production, in particular soybean production in Brazil. And then more recently, a drought across the Middle East and North Africa, which has seen big drops in production. Now, these are areas, as we're going to see, are large importing areas, but their local production is important as well. And then lastly, supply and labor constraints that affected palm oil production, particularly typhoon in Malaysia. Malaysia's had problems getting laborers to work in the palm orchards due to COVID, and all of that contributed to reductions in supplies. That produced low inventory, so that's brought down stock levels. I think it's important to remember that stock levels are best seen in sort of a relative sense. These are ending year projections for stocks to use ratio, and you can see that particularly if you look at the world without China and look, because largely we don't know exactly how much stocks China holds. They rarely make it onto world markets. And in some cases, China continues to be a big importer of both of feed grains and wheat over the last couple of years. So looking at stocks of use without China, these are essentially stocks held by major exporting countries. They're the lowest levels for wheat since 2007-8, again, when we had big price spikes then. Corn, 2012-13, soybeans around 2012 as well. This was the time where we had big drought in North America. And then rice, by contrast, is the one market where prices have been much more moderate, and that's largely due to the fact that we have very, very high production levels. Now, the other side of it that Dave is going to get into is that we've seen rising production costs. Fertilizer costs have been increasing, in part driven by the fact that we have very high energy costs, again, partly due to the recovery due to COVID, but natural gas prices in particular have been skyrocketing, as we'll see. All of that has meant that production costs have increased, that combined with labor costs. Next slide. So now we have a war, and as Nicoletta mentioned, these are, the area has changed dramatically over the last 25 years. 25 years ago, both Ukraine and Russia were net importers of most grains following the collapse of the former Soviet Union. What happened is the area became transformed with a lot of investment, a lot of improved plant varieties, improved infrastructure, such that now they are very large, accounting for over a quarter of the feed grain market for things like barley, almost 20% of the market for maize. Wheat, again, is between 30 and 35%, depending on what year you're looking at, and sunflower oil over 75%, including 50% some odd by Ukraine alone. So all of this very, very important, and combined, one of the things David has pioneered has been converting trade values traded agricultural commodities into their calorie value, so that they can be aggregated in a way that makes sense. And we get roughly 6% for Ukraine, roughly the similar amount for Russia. So over 12% of globally traded agricultural markets on a kilocalorie basis are being affected by this war. Next slide. So what's happened, of course, is after the invasion, these market prices, which had already been at high levels, all of a sudden took off, started to soar. Wheat prices jumped almost 50% because it was particularly hard hit, or is a commodity that again, Ukraine and Russia are very important suppliers for. But you can see over to the right, the more recent price data, it's been highly volatile. And I think that I get questions from the press all the time about how much is this speculation. And I think it's important to remember that stocks are low. And whenever stocks are low, any new information that hits the market causes market reactions. And we've seen the market try to absorb information that's come in over the last 2 or 3 months, be it the condition of the U.S. winter wheat crop, or announcements by India that they're putting on export restrictions, or other sorts of things. All of these things have had big impacts on prices, and then they may moderate a bit. But again, anytime you have very, very high or very low stocks, that the market information can have very, very big impacts on price levels. Next slide, Dave. The other market that I think that is important to mention is the vegetable oil market. And here the market is dominated by 4 major oils, the largest of which is palm oil. And palm oil, as I mentioned, there were supply conditions in Malaysia. We've also had biodiesel production, which is extremely important that is driving vegetable oil prices. As many of you know, Indonesia has a 30% mandate on blending of biodiesel into their fuel supply. U.S. right now, almost 50% of soybean oil consumed in the U.S. is in the form of biodiesel. And so these have been very big drivers at a time when, again, in each of these markets, we've seen production shortfalls. I mentioned Malaysia for palm oil, Canada for rapeseed oil, soybean oil with the drought in Brazil, and then lastly with the war itself in sunflower oil. And again, all these have had big impacts, indirect impacts on vegetable oil prices. Next slide. So I'm just going to look at two different countries because it is important, as I say, it's very heterogeneous to see what the vulnerabilities of particular countries are. This is the case of Yemen. Yemen consumes a lot of their daily consumption comes in the form of wheat and wheat products. And you can see that there's a lot of that is sourced from Ukraine and Russia. And after that, there are other commodities like barley and maize. These, again, some of these from other areas, but just to go down the rows, all these are important. Not all are affected directly by Ukraine and Russia, but all of them have seen, a lot of these products have seen rising world prices. Next slide. And contrast that with West Africa, where, again, if you look at the importance of wheat, it really falls to number 4, really where you'll see bread consumption and, you know, a little bit of couscous, but bread primarily and some pasta, I guess, largely in urban areas that, you know, elsewhere in West Africa, the main grains and main sources of calories are going to be tubers and products like yams or cassava or other grains like millet and sorghums. And, you know, again, wheat's important, but it's important because of its consumption in urban markets. And I think there we'll probably see, if we're going to see demand rationing in the world, it's probably going to be in areas like this where it's a minor, more minor part of daily diets. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it to you, David.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for being here. So you have seen what has happened and is happening on the food markets, or at least the commodity markets, both the grains and the oilseeds. I'm now going to move to another part of the story, but as you see on this first graph, things are intricated. So here you see the price of energy in black, the price of fertilizer in green, and the price of food, actually here it's grains, in red. And as you can see, they are used to move together. Especially, we see them reacting together in period of crisis. It was true in 2008, it was true in 2011, and it's true today. But we also tend to see the fertilizer price reacting much more than the overall energy price and the food price, is because actually fertilizer supply is even much more inelastic than energy product, and energy product are in general more inelastic than food product. Meaning that overall farmer in the world can readjust more quickly, and even, you know, demand can adjust, but we see this. And the two other points I want to make on this figure is, now when fertilizer prices increase quicker than, at a quicker rate than grain prices, that's a problem for farmers, because their margins are crushed, and in some cases they face both either a liquidity issue, meaning that today in a number of places, farmers doesn't have enough money just to buy fertilizer, even if potentially they will recover it later with higher food prices. But on some markets right now, like rice, for instance, because the price of rice have not increased, there is not only a problem of liquidity, but potentially of solvability in this context. And there is the need also to draw a lesson from that, and we will revisit this about, you know, is it a problem of being exposed to fertilizer, or is it about which type of fertilizer we are using, or also how we can adjust to these changes that are important. Now, just on the more recent event, you see that since January 2020, actually price of fertilizer have been basically multiplied by 3 over 1 year. They have been multiplied by 2. That's something we see both on world markets and at the country level in most cases, and I will explain why in a coming slide. But you see how 3 events have really pushed these prices high. On one hand, the rise of energy prices, in particular natural gas, starting in the middle of 2020, after the big collapse of the demand coming from COVID-19, step by step, demand has started to been rebuilt on energy product and prices have started to rise. Then we have seen a number of export restrictions started by China in the fall of last year. And of course, the Russian invasion has been the last drop. And the Russian invasion also have triggered some sanctions. We can rediscuss this part during the Q&A. In the last few weeks, actually fertilizer prices have started to fall a bit. But sometimes you will see also in the media, prices are falling by 10% last month. Yeah, but they are still, basically double the price that they were 1 year ago. So we have to be careful about sometimes, what is the big pictures compared to a week-to-week or a month-to-month change. That same thing for, in some case, the food price index on FAO. When people say, prices are starting to decrease, yeah, but they are still much, much higher than 1 year or even 3 years ago. And that's what matters actually for many people. So when we now agree that these things are linked and directly impacted by the crisis, I'm just going to take the example of the natural gas in particular, because the main fertilizer we use globally are nitrogenous fertilizers, so based on ammonia, and ammonia is done today at least mainly, or not to say exclusively, with fossil fuel, either natural gas in most countries, and that represents 80% of the production of ammonia, or with coal, in particular in China, and that's about 70-80% of the ammonia production. But what you see here is the purple line is a natural gas price in the US, and the blue line is the natural gas in Europe. And as you see, for a long time, these prices were pretty close and also pretty low. But starting at the end of 2020, we have seen rising prices coming from strong demand in Europe, also part of shifting to natural gas that has been seen as a cleaner source of energy compared to other fossil fuel, in particular for electricity production, but also rising issues with Russia. And now we are just operating at a totally different level of prices in Europe and in the US that are bringing, because the only way to connect this market is through liquefied natural gas, but you need infrastructure and you need specific ships to do that. And right now there is complete bottleneck. So what you see is, of course, Europe that doesn't want to buy, or right now even the Russian doesn't want to sell as much natural gas to Europe than before. So Europe is going on the world market, bringing more natural gas from the US, from the Gulf countries, that are also pushing basically now start, you see in the last part of the line for the US, actually prices in the US also start to take up coming from this external demand, but we see the same things in the Gulf countries. And overall, it means that natural gas starts to be more expensive everywhere. So producing fertilizer is more expensive everywhere. But in Europe, you are at such a high level of natural gas, and now also shortage in some places, that fertilizer plants just stop to produce. It has happened several times in the last 6 months. So you have a shortage of fertilizer in the European Union. That is a big market for fertilizer. And what's happened is that farmers and companies in the EU go on world markets to buy urea and ammonia directly. Because actually for them, it's easier to buy ammonia than to buy liquefied natural gas. So you start to see this competition effect impacting the global markets. And of course, European actors have a higher purchasing power than, let's say, some African countries on this. So that creates competition, and that's going to be an issue. Now, just to, not sure how much you know about this fertilizer market, but they are even more concentrated than the food market when you think about, exporters. And actually, over the last 30 years, world food market have started to be more deconcentrated. We felt the rising power in Latin America that have challenged the Quad that were occupying the market before, but also Ukraine and Russia. And a number of middle income countries now also on some products have joined the fray on food markets. On fertilizer, that's not really the case. The biggest diversification we have seen is actually China moving from being a net importer to a net exporter, but also being a big player on nitrogenous and phosphate. But overall, the big numbers is that 80% of the potash used in the world has been traded internationally. And among this 80%, you also have 70 to 80%, depending on the year, that just come from 3 countries, Canada, Belarus, and Russia. And that's why on the right lower corner of the slide, you see a map about the dependency of Russian and Belarus import of K. And basically, most of the countries in the world depend significantly from these 2 sources. North America, a bit less, because North America will mainly source its potash from Canada, so the US are less exposed, but even Brazil is concerned. And so that means that, global food security is going to be impacted, because moving from Bangladesh to Brazil, this shortage of fertilizer, in particular K, but also nitrogenous and phosphate, is going to be problematic. So depending on which type of fertilizer we talk, the yield consequences can be seen this year or actually in the coming year by depriving soil from nutrients. But just to say, that's a real concern. And typically, that's where also the sanction part is quite important in the discussion. And as you see, it's both Belarus and here the same thing just for N. And here we'll see that here the ratio between how much nitrogen you import compared to what you use. And except for a couple of, so North Africa is a bit different, but obviously in Sub-Saharan Africa, you have nitrogenous production in Nigeria, because Nigeria has natural gas. Senegal may be another country that can use this natural gas in the coming years to do that. Ethiopia has some plant locally, but basically all the continent import massively is nitrogenous fertilizer. And that's why how much competition we are going to see between kind of small players and poor players like Africa and bigger players like European Union or even Brazil is going to be, or Australia is going to be quite important. And we will revisit this question about, so what about this fertilizer in the conclusion. Now, about vulnerability of countries. As you see, there's a number of drivers that are creating this turmoil on the energy, the fertilizer, and the food market. But on top of this, and sometimes as the reaction of this, we also see export restriction. So countries limiting their export of food product. And here you have an example on the left-hand side where we see that the level of restriction is pretty high and have increased sharply after the invasion and are remaining high, even if there is a number of, for example, Indonesia has removed their export ban, but they have kept a number of export restrictions, including higher export taxes on palm oil. But also the fertilizer market is impacted by this. And on this slide, I'm just talking about export restrictions. So things that exporters apply themselves. And when you combine with the sanction on the fertilizer market, that's a bit more extreme. But really, this is how policy response, and in particular, uncoordinated policy response, magnify a problem that exists. And typically, it's a kind of also a prisoner dilemma, because each country thinks that if they don't do it, they will be worse off. And you have both sometimes a panic and a domino effect at stake. So here also some things to revisit about the policy response and what we need in terms of potential global infrastructure to deal with that. But of course, we have talked a lot about the world markets. Here, I just want to show inflation at the country level, and you have a number of also local drivers that are impacting this. In some cases, it can be conflict. In some cases, it can be actually drought that making things worse in the Horn of Africa. But we also have countries that have an history of inflation themselves, like Argentina, or of course Venezuela, but also Turkey. And that's where also the type of policy response or narrative that we hear from policymakers, we just have to be very careful about it. Because when you listen to people in Argentina that say the main reason why the price of bread increase is world markets and that's why we need an export restriction, you know that that's a bit of not the case. And if you go back in their history, basically their export restrictions have never been really efficient to deal with their inflation problem at home, including on food products. So just to think that there's other drivers behind food inflation that go beyond even this commodity price of things. Now, in terms of vulnerability of countries, I also want to illustrate here, sorry, the color are a bit pastels, that because we have at the same time an increase in the prices of, yes, wheat, corn, fertilizer, but natural gas, oil, other minerals, gold, and even commodity like cotton, all the countries right now are not facing the same external constraints you want. And that's going to be important for their current account, their access to resources. So obviously a country like Sri Lanka right now is suffering from a lot of issues, and they don't have any external source of currency to compensate for that. When a country like Algeria or Iraq, that are also big net food importers, they have actually the fiscal means, but also the external inflows of currency to deal with any current account problem. So, you know, even when we have discussion about, what we should do about Africa, Africa is more than 55 countries with very different situation. And we just make sure that we understand this before starting to come with large-scale response and so on. So when you combine this question of direct exposure to Black Sea, the question of food import dependency, the macroeconomic vulnerability, the fertilizer import dependency, and some of the initial dynamics, you have this type of map that we have done at the beginning of the crisis, especially also to guide what should be the type of priority that policymakers should look at. And sometimes do not forget about countries, because in the first week of the crisis, there was obviously a lot of focus on Arab countries and big wheat-dependent countries. But we really have to make the point that it's not just about wheat. Other food commodities are going up, so it's a problem for other countries. Then some countries that, for example, also have a poultry sector that have been developed recently, import a lot of feed, and this is going to be a problem for them. But moving to Pakistan, to Bangladesh, or even a country in Central America, you have other type of vulnerabilities that we should not forget. And obviously, a number of countries in Central Asia have also to deal with their own challenges based on their level of integration with Russia. Last but not least, we didn't talk so much about the situation in Ukraine, both in terms of production and food insecurity. I just want to make clear that that's obviously the region that is most impacted by what is going on in terms of war. So it's not that we don't want to, it's not that we want to forget about them. It's just their situation is so extreme, and it's a war, first of all, and the blockade. And that's not about are markets efficient or not, or what should be the policy response in terms of subsidies. This being said, let's now start to move to conclusion. We still have a few things to say, but also we want to keep time for discussion. And I will summarize everything that we have seen so far around four items. First is, don't think that just by reopening the Ukrainian ports or even having peace tomorrow in Ukraine is going to bring back the situation back to normal. There was other drivers. We still with a number of climate-related shocks. Ukrainian agriculture itself is going to take years to recover, depending of what's going on. So we need really to think about, of course, short-term action, but medium and long-term agenda. Also because other crises will come, and then we can, see what can be done. Markets have started to adjust. So, even if you are in Senegal today and you cannot bring your wheat from Ukraine, you get more wheat coming from Argentina, and you have managed to compensate. Now it's more expensive, but we see both on the importer side and the exporter side and on the producer side, adjustment already occurring. Now it's going to take a few production cycles, both in the Northern Hemisphere and in the Southern Hemisphere, to readjust with the new situation and also to rebuild inventories. Because as Joe has said, when we are still dealing with low level of inventories, any bad news is going to bring prices high and basically create an affordability issue for poor consumers and poor countries. Now, also we have to be careful about not sacrificing the long-term food transformation agenda to the short-term crisis. So, we will discuss it more in detail, but any idea, we need to cut trees in order to have more agricultural land, or we just need to open the floodgate of fertilizer subsidies to fix the problem, will have also consequences tomorrow. And that's what we really want to be careful. And overall, we need really to address this crisis with policy response that are based on evidence and not gut feeling or emotional thinking. For example, today, we are going to see that a number of policy response can be good for people in Ukraine, but may not be the best response at the global level. So really, we need to tailor and adjust policy response to the problem at stake and look at the cost-benefit analysis, including in terms of environmental sustainability of this measure. Because honestly, if we are in this situation today, the impact of global warming recently and the number of climate shock we see with drought in many places in the world has a more severe consequences than the Ukrainian war per se. In the last 2 years, we have lost more cereals and oilseed production due to the drought in Canada, La Nina in Latin America, heat wave in Europe, than the whole Ukrainian production. So, sometimes we need to rescale also what are the problems for the long run stability of the system and how we create resilience and actions. Now, we've also, Joe, at the beginning, that linked to that, we say, okay, on the short term, first, you need to do no harm. You need to make sure that you are removing some of the bad policies in place. We need to have enough money to do what is needed, both in terms of humanitarian action and safety nets. And obviously, there is a discussion about where this money will come from, but also, is it loans? Is it grants? Because we already have a debt problem in some of these low-income countries. So asking them to get more indebted to survive during a couple of years, it's not going to be a good solution. And then we, obviously, there's a number of things we don't want to do. I already talked about export restriction, having sanctions that limit food and fertilizer trade is also not something we want. Then we can discuss, are the sanctions really impact this directly, indirectly? That's a full discussion that I will be happy to have. Also, we need to make sure that we let farmers do and make the decision they want with the right incentive. So when you see countries saying, oh, we have a problem on wheat, we are just going to subsidize wheat production, that's a bit worrisome, because in some cases, that's not more wheat that you need. You may want to do other crops, or you want also to think about, do you need to eat as much wheat, or you just need to also rethink a bit your diets. And even in the short run, for a number of Arab countries, there is an overconsumption of wheat that has been driven by subsidies. So there is some action to be taken. And then, to find the balance in terms of what will be the role of international trade and markets on this. Because once again, due to climate shock, finding countries that can say, okay, I'm going to be systematically self-sufficient is going to be difficult. Maybe large economies can do it, but you see Morocco this year, Morocco has the worst drought for 30 years. They are going to lose 50% of their grain production. They have to go on world markets. They have to go on regional markets. And we need this market to exist on a regular basis. You know, it's not just, you cannot just ask to find exporters, see if on the regular basis, there is no global market. But what is their role, how they are regulated? And for example, today we have seen the WTO ministerial decision of, or at least find the fact that we can exempt WFP shipment from export ban. I mean that, you know, that's very minimal things we can aim if we want both importers and exporters to benefit from global disciplines and rules to manage trade relations. So this being said, 3 points that we are going to visit because I think that in terms of sustainability, they are important. Clearly, there is a lot of debate right now about how we produce food and what it means for fertilizer. Then there is a question about what we want to do with our land in terms of food, feed, biofuel, but also ecosystem services. In some cases, we can do everything. In some cases, no, we have some trade-off, but they depend also where we are in the world. So here, I mean, we just also want to make sure that we don't paste and copy the policy recommendation for the Netherlands to the situation in Malawi. There are similarities, but there are also differences that we don't want to forget. And of course, this is not the first crisis. Obviously, it's not going to be the last, and there is some lessons learned about how to deal with this, what is the role of information, what is the role of cooperation, but also what are the limits. I'm going to talk about the first one, and then Joe will cover the last 2 ones, and then we will be done for the presentation. So can we do without mineral fertilizer? Simple answer is just no, at least for the next 20 or 30 years, based on the technology we have. We need this synthetic fertilizer. If you see at the world level, the relation between yield and fertilizer intake, it's very clear. There's also a simple balance story. The more food we get out of the soil, it means that the more nutrients we get out of the soil. And because these nutrients go to cities, and based on what we do with human waste, these nutrients end up in the sea, at one point, you still need to bring more on the farm, and you cannot just compensate with manure. So there is potentially a rethink about some of the system, but that will require a lot of things. Now, can we use the fertilizer we have more responsibly? Yes. There is a lot of waste, and some are also driven by wrong incentive and wrong policies. And there is also the fact that is very important is that organic fertilizer should go hand in hand with synthetic or mineral fertilizer, because what is key is soil health. And you can put, you know, even all the synthetic fertilizer you want. If your soil are degraded, you will get less and less return on it. So really rebuilding soil health, dealing with land degradation, in order to get most of what we want from the synthetic fertilizer, make a lot of sense economically, but also environmentally. Because if fertilizers are expensive, you also want to make sure that what we use is really useful, because waste is also an economic waste beyond the environmental waste. The other aspect is how we get this fertilizer, and right now the big discussion is on ammonia. You have seen that if we continue to do ammonia with traditional technology, and basically with natural gas, first, there is a significant emission problem coming from this. For 1 ton of ammonia, you basically produce 2 tons of CO2. You can try to do blue ammonia, meaning capturing it, but there is a cost and there's a problem. Cannot try in this. But so more focus is on green ammonia. And there is opportunities actually to do greener ammonia. That's why it's called. And basically it means that you want to produce it with electricity that will come from renewable source. But you see, it's mainly investing in renewable electricity first of all. But now we have a new challenge, that the competition. Because we are on track to, and we have countries that want to use this ammonia as a source of energy. as a source of fuel, in particular for the international maritime transportation, with big ramping up in the next 10 years. But then also we want to use it for farmers. And if we cannot scale the production of green ammonia and beyond it green electricity, we are going to see high price of ammonia. And here also the poor farmers will never get access to this type of input that they are going to need in order to raise the level of productivity without impoverishing their soil, because that's unfortunately what we see today in Africa. Many farmers are extracting more nutrients through the crops they grow than what they can put in the soil today. And now I'm giving back the floor to Joe that will discuss the two other aspects that we think are important when we think sustainability. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I'm going to try to be brief here because I would like to get to the Q&As and we're rapidly running out of time. But David mentioned this whole demand for land. And we've had these big debates in the past, certainly the 2007-8, 2010-11, the price spikes then. There was all the concern with biofuel production, this food versus fuel issue. And again, I think so biofuel policies are still germane. I think probably the more controversy now has shifted towards biodiesel. I say more just because ethanol is profitable in many parts of the world, be it made of sugar or even corn-based ethanol in the U.S. right now as an octane enhancer. I think you could get rid of the mandates. You should get rid of the mandates, but I don't think you would have that much change in land use. Biodiesel is very different. It's expensive to make relative to petroleum-based diesels. It has and has direct impact on vegetable oils and other food products. In the U.S., for example, I think I mentioned almost 50% of the soybean oil produced in the U.S. or consumed in the U.S. now is consumed in the form of biodiesel. A lot of other areas have this, and you can see from the chart that a lot of the shift in annual demand or consumption of vegetable oil is driven in part by this. The other big issue is actually the fact that so much land is devoted to feed grain production, and the fact that animal production is so extensive. I would say, in contrast to biofuels, which are largely driven by mandates and subsidies, that's less the case with livestock. That this is a demand issues. I think that shifting to talk about climate or nutrition, everyone recognizes the problem with animal production, but you are really talking about consumer demand, and I think that's poses a big problem. Let me turn to the last slide, David, and that's really to talk about market information, and I'll put on a different hat. I'm also acting or interim secretary for the Agricultural Market Information System, AMIS, which has been around since 2011, was one of the outcomes of the 2011 G20 ministerial, created a group that could provide evidence-based information on agricultural markets, with the thought that with improved market information that governments around the world could look at this information, consider it objective, and not make the sort of policy mistakes that we saw during 2007-8 and 2010-11. I think from an information basis, those of you who may be familiar with AMIS, we put out a market monitor that is not updated on a daily basis. So if you're a market trader, that's not where you would go for information. But I think for policymakers, it actually works quite well, very comprehensive in terms of what it's looking at. And now it looks that AMIS will now expand into doing more work on fertilizer availability and supply and demand issues, and more work on vegetable oil markets. But you can see even there we do a up-to-date modeling with GeoGlam, which is one of our partners in which is a consortium of Earth observation observatories that contribute forecasts on crop production. And so now, as I mentioned earlier, that how important information is, and how particularly at periods when we have tight supplies and strong demand, I think the role for Amos is even important, or is even more important now than it was maybe even 11 years ago. But with that, let me conclude. David, last slide. And we have a lot of blogs, I think almost 20 some odd blogs now on various aspects of the war and how it's affecting various markets in various regions. And you should look at that. We're certainly not done. I have a feeling we'll be writing these things for many months to come. So, but Nicoletta, I think we'll turn it back to you at this point.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, David. This was very, very insightful. I think he gave a 360 on the situation. And also, I really like the part and suggestion on policy implications. And there's a question in the chat from John Jack, but before that, may I exploit my chair position to ask you myself a couple questions. So I think, I mean, the big question, there are two issues here. One is the price issue, which is gonna, of course, be transmitting to inflation more generally and in wages and be embedded. So that's an economic problem. And then there's a shorter issue, and the two are related for more vulnerable categories, both within countries and across countries, given differences in purchasing powers, in different distributions. But from your perspective, it seems to me that from your maps, David and Joe, there doesn't seem to be a big issue for the Northern Hemisphere, with Russia, of course, winning out of the situation. And then for Europe, everything was like light turquoise, which means little impact on food costs. But I'm from Italy, and we have really sinister reports of prices going up and stocks being completely used up. There are reports on TV with, you see the grain to make pasta just completely, the hangars are completely empty, and prices just skyrocketing. So I couldn't just reconcile that. Is that map about the future, and of course the Prime Minister talking about famine in the fall. So, I mean, that would kind of go against your suggestion not to do panic buying, because, if your messaging to the population is that, prepare for a very dark winter, I think that's not really helping the cause here. And I don't know if that map you had on costs was, when was the timing of that? The other one, just a reflection on fertilizer. I think, David, you made a good case for the need to integrate, systems and do apply these fertilizers not in excess. There's always been a problem, especially when prices are low. People just splurge. But there are also plans, for example, in Europe, the farm to fork, to reduce at least by a fifth the use of fertilizers. And like for the energy transition, this is an important transition to take care of. And so in your plan, I mean, you envisage there an amount, something achievable at the short end now, to minding that all we do now is going to take effect, with a lag because of the natural cycles of agricultural production. So these are my two questions, one on that map and one on the fertilizer. If you can elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that in terms of quotas. I don't think the US is doing anything on fertilizers, nor China, but
let me answer the first one on food prices, and David can chime in on that, obviously, and talk a little about fertilizers as well. But I mean, I realize it, particularly in developed economies, that the underlying farm value of commodities is a very small part of the retail food price, and so if you, you know, in the U.S., we always use the example of wheat, where wheat prices are roughly 5% of the value or the cost of wheat is roughly 5% of the value of a loaf of bread. You know, that certainly is going to differ by country, and for developing countries, that margin is a lot smaller. But I mean, you think wheat prices have about doubled over the last 18 months. If I look at CPI for bread, it's up about 9% over the last 12 months. So little apples and oranges, I realize. But I think that you got to remember, part of the problem is all the post-farm gate components are also under, at least here in the US, have been impacted by the general inflationary trends. So all the energy costs embodied in, you know, transforming a bushel of wheat into milling it into flour, transforming it into a loaf of bread, packaging, moving it to retail stores, et cetera. Now, I might add, I don't think Italy will be facing a famine. There is an issue with you know, classes of wheat. So when we look at durums and you know, good high quality pasta wheats, you know, those have a slightly different balance sheet. There is a little bit of substitution at some level, but you know, if durum wheat prices or durum supplies are tight, then those prices are going to pass on higher costs potentially. But again, most of those costs are going to be in things like labor costs and most of those post-farm gate costs. I'm much less worried in the developed world about food price inflation. But that said, food price inflation in the U.S. is at the for food consumed at home. So, you know, what one is buying at the grocery store, that's close to 11.5%, 11.6%, I believe. Highest level since early 1979. So I'm not just saying anything. I'm not saying that it's not important, but again, these prices aren't doubling; they are increasing by, you know, in the order of 7 to 10%, and we are beginning to see some products like meat prices come down in the U.S. So I think, you know, that's. Let me stop there, and I'll let David add and talk about the other.
Yes, no, I think that, yes, this issue about the fact that in advanced economies, we have on one hand, consumers that spend a much lower part of their income on food product, especially if you compare even just to energy product overall. And the fact that in the case of bread, it's 95% of the cost of bread that is not linked to the wheat price per se. We have different drivers, so that's where, in terms of direct impact on the population and the country, they don't appear so much on the map. And also, I think the case of pasta and durum wheat is interesting because countries doesn't source durum wheat from Ukraine. So you know why we have a problem on durum wheat is much more related to the drought condition in Europe. Same thing in North Africa for semolina and things like this, than trying to sometimes blame the problem on something else. That's what I want us to make sure that when we have discussion on policies, we identify the problem, the source of the problem, and we design the solution targeting this. But the general inflation is there. Now, I will say that I had a discussion with colleagues in South Korea, for instance, earlier this week. South Korea, that is a net food importer, a net energy importer, and also trade in the part of the world that have a number of what I will call unreliable countries, meaning countries that can put export restriction and have put export restriction, make these high-income countries, for example, more vulnerable than the European countries, because most of the European countries are trading with other European countries, so they are not going to suffer from an export ban, even if, you know, Hungary or Slovenia or sometime Romania wake up. Obviously, the Commission come back and say, please, you know that we are part of an integrated market. So, you know, that's why institution matters. But also a number of European countries right now are kind of shielded thanks to the euro of having to deal with their own current account constraints. When, yes, other countries that are a bit more lonely are facing a shock in a much more extreme way. On the fertilizer, I mean, and Joe can also come back to it. I mean, the US are more about, we are going to produce more fertilizer than to say we are going to try to use the fertilizer we have more efficiently. Now, at the same time, let's be honest also, the US and Europe has done a lot of effort in terms of fertilizer efficiency, sometimes due to precision agriculture. So still not perfect. And we still have some places that, and you think about the Mississippi, that receive a lot of nitrogenous and phosphate, meaning that there is a lot of leakages, but overall progress have been made. And for the farm to fork policy, when I understand the initial goal, I'm just worried about the indicator per se. I mean, reducing the amount of fertilizer for me doesn't make any sense if we don't have an increase in efficiency. You know, I will not care how much fertilizer Europe is using if we had an efficiency of 100%, meaning that every fertilizer we put in the soil end up in the plant, or we have a circular economy, and that will be nice. But just saying use less fertilizer without really looking at are we using it efficiently, for me, is a big problem in the policy design and in the policy monitoring, and in some cases, even incentive for farmers, or what type of technology we need to make sure that we are not wasting fertilizer. After the fact that, you know, you get very high productivity in some part of Europe using a lot of fertilizer, that's good for Europe, that's good for the world, because we have also good soil in Europe, and we have soil that have good health. Really, the question is, are we wasting fertilizer? Are we degrading soil? And so I will be much more interesting to see this kind of outcome indicators, to look at the performance of the food system and the agriculture, much more than this kind of input indicator saying use less. Yeah, if you use less, of course, you may waste less, but it's not sure that you are going to really make a system more efficient and sustainable, and that's what we need. So that's my concern on this. Since I have the floor, I can just say the quick question, because I will have not to say on the Eritrea question that is in the chat about the potash production. Yes, Eritrea is one of the countries where we can have more potash. There was some investment, but right now, don't think that a lot are reaching the markets. And in any case, I mean that 90% of the potash that will be coming from Eritrea is already locked in contracts for the next 10 years. So we already know where it will go. But just to say that, and that's the situation we deal with this even mining operation, is the lag between the time where you take the investment decision, the amount of risk you take, because that was the same thing in Canada. You know, a few years ago, potash prices were low. And when you have seen companies taking the risk to invest in Canada or in Eritrea, people will say, you will never reach profitability. Now, they are going to make a lot of money. And so people are going to tell, you are profiting from the situation, you make extra profits, we are going to tax you. What I just want to make sure is that, you know, we are also aligning this incentive properly, thinking that when you deal with investment that are 10, 20 years life cycle, we just don't want to change, you know, fiscal regime or tax regime on the spot just because we think we have to, because we need more investment also on these potash sectors. Yes, potash and phosphate, you know, the alternative compared to what we do in terms of nitrogenous production, that's a tough story actually, because green potash is not for tomorrow. So that's just the clarification I wanted to bring.
Thanks. I don't see other questions here, so I may ask one more question myself, which is a clarification on. So first of all your presentation goes to prices and vulnerability of import costs, dependencies and interdependencies. Of course, there's a human side to this, which is the food shortage impact on people entering into hunger and poverty, and that there are estimates for this, right, which are kind of sort of be catastrophic sometimes. And you mentioned in your conclusions that it's going to take quite a while to restore sort of normality, whatever normality was, because trends are not looking good with climate change and so forth. And you mentioned something like 18 months, also because you were saying it would take time to redress the Ukrainian soil situation and harvest if it hasn't been sowed or didn't produce. But what about, my question is about Russia inventories. So Russia is a big player too. And although there aren't, and correct me if I'm wrong, 'cause I might be wrong, there aren't any sanctions on exports, I think, of grains from Russia or fertilizer, but I might be wrong. Certainly, there is a connection between the financial sanctions to some extent, right? And the food situation, in that financial sanctions do have an effect on the exports, as the financial industry underwrites the country's commodity businesses, and these are blacklisted. And some global maritime shipping companies have announced cessation of operation with Russia. So what is the linkage there? I mean, can we hope that, or should we, as soon as this war hopefully ends, just make sure that Russia can also freely export? I mean, what would that help? Besides trying to, of course, to renormalize production in Ukraine, to alleviate the pressure on prices and shortages, or is that something, prices will, are unaffected by this? It looks by the shares you showed, it might matter.
Maybe I will start, and Joe, you will even conclude on this. I think that thinking about the global food security of the world without Russia continuing to produce and export, it will be very weird and dangerous, just due to the sheer size of Russia, including in the context of climate change, where Russia may be one of the countries in the world that can significantly increase its agricultural production due to global warming, and just how we can move north some of our production. Now, for the sanction, as of today, yes, food exports are excluded. Exports for luxury products like caviar, that the EU has some thing on that. Now the EU have introduced restriction on potash from Russia, so some fertilizers are actually now covered by some sanction. Of course, the EU has also sanction on Belarus and Belarus companies, and some also people. So you have still some kind of direct impact on some sanction on the fertilizer sectors, but the broader picture is on what I would say over-compliance about a number of economic actors, either in Europe, in the US, or in third parties that doesn't want to do business with Russia due to the fear of consequences. So you have shipping companies, you have banks, you have insurance. And that's in this context that, for example, the comfort letter that the US want to release to say, no, under some condition, you can do business with Russia and you will have no problem, that can help. But I think also there is, clearly how the private sector is looking at sanctions. We have also the experience about, what has happened with Cuba, what has happened with Iran, and it's pretty complex to manage them. So yes, going back to normal on food trade, I think is needed. Otherwise, also what we can see is a more fragmentation of global food trade. If the country that will be friendly to Russia and trade with Russia, the other countries that are not friendly with Russia trading with Europe and things like this. But once again, due to climate change and the fact that we see more risk, it's very important that we pool risks together. Because 1 year we are going to have a drought in Russia, 1 year we are going to have a drought in France, 1 year a drought in Brazil, and it's only by being flexible enough that the world can go through that. So that's something. The other aspect I think also we have to think about is Russia depends not only on Western companies to trade some of their grains, and we have seen how Cargill and Bunge stop some activity or phase out. Also because some of their staff were not comfortable to work with Russia. Sometimes there is also, I would say, a moral dimension to this, not only for country, but for people. But I also think that after a few years, if Russia doesn't have access to machinery, seeds, technology from Western countries, or even if they go through some economic crisis, we will see even productivity of Russia going down. And that will be, even for countries that can still trade with Russia, they will still face a weakening of their suppliers. So managing the future in a way that makes sense from a diplomatic point of view, a moral point of view, but also taking care of food insecurity globally. And once again, I think it's even diplomatically, it's important, because just saying to countries in Africa, don't trade with Russia, is not going to work, okay? And you need really to accept the fact that we need compensation package. We need to listen to people that say, I have a problem, and not just say, oh, sanctions have no impact. I'm not saying that sanctions have a lot of impact. For sure, they have some, but also we need to engage rationally on this discussion. And giving back the floor to Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is in our figure of 18 months, I mean, that really includes Russia continue to be an exporter all during this time. The real problem right now is, the 20 million tons or so of last year's harvest that are stuck in Ukraine. Ukraine exports prior to the war anywhere from 5 to 6 million tons of grain out through Odessa and it's in those southern ports. Going overland right now is just not very feasible. Even with trying to expedite things, because of all the transportation bottlenecks that have been well publicized, the rail gauges and having the intramodals having to transfer to barges, having to transfer then to finally move grain all the way down to through Constanta or up through the Baltic ports. All that adds enormous costs, 4 times the transportation costs of moving that out through the Black Sea. And I've been in a lot of meetings over the last several weeks where people have talked about creating these new corridors. Can't we talk about how to shift grain from moving out through the Black Sea to moving overland through into Europe or into the EU? And I think the very real problem is that while some of that is going to be necessary on a temporary basis, we still have this big problem of it just can't accommodate the volumes that we've seen. And at the end of the day, if indeed the situation does return to normal, at least in the sense of the southern ports opening up, that grain will go right back to going out through the southern ports because that's the most economical. So I think there's going to be a lot of reluctance to put in a lot of investments that will all be stranded costs. You're not going to create, despite what I've heard from some policymakers, a new intramodal direction for Ukraine grain, except in the very extreme case of thinking of Russia annexing the southern part of the country ultimately. But presuming that they get back to being able to export through the Black Sea again, and hopefully that will happen. Hopefully this will all normalize very quickly, although I share your doubts about that. I think the main, this is going to be a temporary issue, and it's going to be it's going to cause higher prices, and it's going to take a while for production elsewhere to sort of rebound, to sort of fill that gap. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe and David. It was very clear. We have a couple of questions, one in the chat, one, and then we close, I think, because we're hitting the 1 p.m. mark. One is about guano. Guano, of course, used to be a fertilizer, very used centuries ago, a couple of centuries ago, and Peru seems to have now resuscitated some of that with some investments. But David already replied. David, do you want to say something about?
Yes, I mean that it's good to be open-minded about looking what you have locally to address your local needs. No, we are not going to see guano ships leaving Chile and Peru to go back through the Cap Horn to go back to Europe in order to provide fertilizers, or as 100 years ago to make gunpowder for the First World War. So I mean, local needs, yes. Then after, I really think that at scale, we just need to see that we need a major revolution about how we produce ammonia, because honestly, if we were able to feed the world in the 20th century, is largely due to the Haber-Bosch innovation and the fact that we were able to produce nitrogenous at scale everywhere and quickly. now we need to think that, this 100 years technology is a bit of outdated to some extent, or at least we need to reframe it in the current context of both getting out of the fossil fuel addiction. And yes, we need investment, and also we need to, I will say typically, what can be done in Africa to not forget about a place where we can have renewable electricity from solar, from wind, I think relatively cheap in the next 10 years. And we can also, at the same time, produce ammonia for the local needs in a clean way. Because at the end, if we just produce more ammonia from coal and natural gas, we are just going to make things worse. So this year, I think we have to be careful. And I
question
can,
on WTO, if you want to, do you see it in the chat? The question on WTO.
I can take that. I think one of the key things there was the agreement by WTO members to exempt humanitarian aid from export restrictions. You might remember that this actually was called for in the G20 communique back in 2011, which was agreed by all the G20 members, only to find that several of the G20 members, when they showed up in Geneva, had different views and blocked that. But it's good to see that the WTO came together here. I think that's very encouraging to at least limit or to have restrictions or exempting humanitarian aid from export restrictions. I think they need to do a lot more, but this is a good first step. I think to have enhanced transparency. David developed this tracker. The WTO does its best to, members are supposed to notify when they put on export restrictions, but we find that those notifications lag several months sometimes, if at all. And so I think the importance of this is still very important. And the fact that WTO members recognize food security is a very key issue. Now what they need to do is roll up their sleeve. Speaking as an old failed trade negotiator, but they need to roll up their sleeves and get to work on the tough issues of domestic support and public stockholding and a whole host of other issues in the ag arena, let alone dealing with things like the appellate body crisis. So,
well, I think we can close here. There are no more questions. I'm sure there are many more questions that people, in front of such expertise, it's hard sometimes to put question. But we're very indebted to you, Joe, and to you, David, for the comprehensiveness and the clarity of your presentation. I think a lot of people learned a lot today. We hope to be able to, we have a last question from Miguel from Spain. Do you want to say it aloud?
No question. Thank you.
Oh, it was just a
mistake. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. And we will post your presentation, if okay with you, and next to the recording, so people can go back and study, those charts, and also especially the final slides are very important for us, because of course the world now finds itself with a number of trade-offs. I mean, you can raise interest rates, or you can maybe stop subsidies to biodiesel, or do both, and there are, I think, a geometry of policy responses, and they should be studied and put in place to avoid the worst of the situation. But thanks again from us all, and I wish both of you and everybody else who was online a wonderful weekend, and hopefully a better world tomorrow. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.